diverse a lot of wildland-urban interface, and we definitely have unique needs for facilitating information exchange between fire scientists and managers and other folks within our region. This slide shows some of the different issues that folks have came up with during our sensing session. People in our region in the North Atlantic are thinking about fire, management, science, working, research, conferences, burning, hurdles, pine, oak, working across state lines, and communicating. Our goals as an exchange are to catalyze collaboration between scientists and land managers, to facilitate the flow of information on science and management, to try to work together to determine innovative solutions, and where we can to synthesize existing research and try to adapt that science for applicability in our region, in the North Atlantic. Some of the outputs that we have a lot of information. We have research briefs and newsletters. We have webinars. We have a website, firesciencenorthatlantic.org. We offer a research database. We have a number of field trips, and we have capstone workshops. Just a quick plug, if you go to the firesciencenorthatlantic.org website, you'll see one of the upcoming workshops that we have, capstone workshop, is taking place in New Jersey, based at Stockton University in Galloway, New Jersey, on November 4th, 5th, and 6th. We're still taking registrations for that. That is 3 weeks from today. It's very affordable, and it's going to be a really great 3 days looking at fire science and management needs in southern New Jersey. This is a photo of our leadership team. We have Nick Skoronsky from the U.S. Forest Service, Aaron Lane, who's working for USDA and in the Climate Hub and facilitating, coordinating our leadership team and the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange. That's me with the purple shirt on. And then to my left there is Inga Lapuma, who is our Science Communications Director. So if you have any questions, if you want to share a story about your experience in fire science and management, you will likely be communicating with Dr. Inga Lapuma. We also have a great suite of community representatives that help keep us informed about fire science and management needs across the region. If you look at our list, you see that we have a diversity of federal, state, local, and nonprofit and academic partners that really help keep us on track and trying to provide the best fire science and management information flow that we can. In sum, never underestimate the power of a small group of committed people to change the world. In fact, it is the only thing that ever has. This is a photo from one of our sensing sections in Massachusetts. We have a lot of great people in our region. So without further ado, I'm going to conclude this portion just describing the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange. And I'm going to turn over the floor to our two speakers today, and allow me to do a brief introduction. Our speakers today are Dr. Luke Dodd and Dr. Mike Lacki. So Luke Dodd has a PhD in entomology from the University of Kentucky, an MS in forestry from the University of Kentucky, and a BS in fisheries and wildlife biology from Arkansas Tech University. Luke's research career has focused on understanding the impact that land management has on bats and their insect prey. Given the ecological significance of insects and the role that predators, such as bats, play in consuming insects, these trophic linkages are important and in need of increased depth and breadth of study. Much of Luke's current work is taking place at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky, where he and other collaborators are seeking to understand the interacting effects of white nose syndrome and prescribed fire on bats and insects. Dr. Mike Lacki is a professor in the Department of Forestry at the University of Kentucky, where he has been employed since December of 1989. Prior to his time at UK, he served on the faculty at Penn State and SUNY Plattsburgh. He received a BS in biology from the University of Dayton, an MS in zoology from Ohio State, and a PhD in zoology from North Carolina State. His primary area of research focus is on management of forest wildlife, with a specialty in forest bats. His career research on bats spans 37 years, covering numerous species and projects across North America. In addition to studies examining the effects of prescribed fire on bats, his current research efforts also include population status, ecology, and potential vulnerability to white nose syndrome of little brown bats in Yellowstone National Park, roosting behavior of northern long-eared bats during staging and swarming at Mammoth Cave National Park, and effects of timber harvesting practices on habitat suitability of Myotis bats in the Central Appalachians. So we probably couldn't ask for a couple of better speakers to address this topic of fire in the northern long-eared bat, vulnerability and management considerations. So now, without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Luke and allow this webinar to really get going. Just give me a moment here. All right, Luke, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and thank you to everyone that's participating today. When Amanda told us that we had the number of people registered for this event that we did, it was really pleasing to Mike and I to have so many people interested in this topic. So as Amanda said, my name is Luke Dodd, and I'm an assistant professor at Eastern Kentucky University. I'll be presenting some very general, broad information about the importance of bats and their roles that they play in terms of ecosystem services here on the front end, and we'll sort of drill down and get to some specifics about Myotis bats and the northern long-eared bat for the latter portion of the presentation today, and Mike Lacki will deliver much of that content. If anyone has any questions after today's presentation, feel free to email either myself or Mike there at the addresses indicated. Before I get rolling with some of the content that we're going to be talking about today, I just quickly would like to acknowledge everyone that's made this work possible up to this point. Currently, Mike and I have projects that are ongoing in a number of different systems, but much of the information we're going to present today comes from work that was taking place at Mammoth Cave National Park and previously on the Daniel Boone National Forest. And so in relation to those grants, we have a number of collaborators and co-investigators to mention. There at Mammoth Cave National Park, I would recognize Steve Thomas and Rick Toomey for their involvement with much of that work. Over the course of Dr. Lacki's career, he's had a number of different students at the University of Kentucky, myself included. Aside from myself, Dan Cox and Joe Johnson have had various roles at Mammoth Cave and in regards to joint fire science projects that have been going through his lab over the years. And much of the work that we've done to this point has been in collaboration with Lynn Risky-Kinney, who was my PhD advisor while I was at the University of Kentucky. Joint fire science projects have been addressed through the University of Kentucky and now with me at EKU in collaboration with Matt Dickinson and Nick Skoronsky, and those two fellows have been involved with a lot of this work. As far as funding on my end, the Joint Fire Science Program has been able to really provide a resource or a funding resource for me to ask some of the questions that we'll be talking about today, and as well as with Mike. And then a couple other sources of funding are mentioned there in relation to some of the ongoing fire work that I have. And of course, this is a summary of a lot of work, so there's a number of techs and students and various volunteers that have helped with this over the years. I guess I would like to start this webinar just very broadly talking about bats as a group within the overall class Mammalia. Bats are the second most diverse order of mammals on the globe, second only to the rodents. And I think the rodents in total account for somewhere in the neighborhood of a quarter to half of the total overall diversity of this taxonomic class of animals. So with bats coming in second, there's a large number of species that we're talking about across the globe, something on the order of around 1,100 different species. Bats as a group are nearly cosmopolitan in where they're found across the globe. Really, they're only absent from Arctic and polar regions and some very, very isolated oceanic islands. But in some instances, bats are the only mammals that you can find that are native to a specific island. Given their capacity for flight, they've actually been able to colonize some of those more remote regions where other terrestrial mammals haven't been able to get to. In terms of their evolutionary success, bats, of course, fly. They are the only group of mammals that are truly capable of flight, and that's been a major key to their success, that in conjunction with their ability to echolocate, their way to exploit nocturnal habitats. That's not something that's been done by other groups. Certainly there are nocturnal birds as well as diurnal birds, but the potential for bats to really be able to forage for insects in a variety of ways related to their maneuverability in flight, that combined with echolocation and their niche that they've carved out in the nighttime landscape has really allowed them to be successful on a grand evolutionary scheme. Bats do eat all kinds of different types of food resources, not just insects, but in large part, this is a group that has really been able to exploit that as a prey resource. Here on the right of this slide is one of the more common overall cladograms that you see for bats all across the globe. I think this comes from Simon et al.'s 2005 publication, and it's been cited since. And this is one of the more common accepted deep phylogenies of bats all around the world. And basically, we have two main groups of bats. The Yen-Pterochiropterans are really the old world fruit bats, and the associated species there, the allies that we can talk about that have the most relationship to that group. And these are the megabats, the pteropodids. They don't necessarily rely on echolocation. They're frugivorous, so they're different than the bulk of bat families. The Yangochiropterans are where we see the vast majority of bat families all around the globe. I've highlighted the Vespertilionids there, and that is the most diverse family of bats that we have currently here on the planet. In general, the Yangochiropteran bats have varied diets, but as I mentioned, they've been able to especially exploit insects as a prey resource. In general, bats are reliant on a heterothermic lifestyle, especially those species that are found in temperate systems. And so going hand in hand with this heterothermic natural history is the need to hibernate. And then, as I've mentioned before too, many bats echolocate, and they use that as their way of orienting across the nocturnal landscape, and it's their way for them to find their food resources that they rely upon. Heterothermy is part and parcel to the bats that we think of in eastern North America. And when I say heterothermy, I'm really referring to an energetic strategy where an animal is able to maintain a varied but regulated set of body temperatures. And that's really in contrast to species that are homeothermic, that maintain a regulated body temperature within relatively narrow limits, or this is also in contrast to species that are poikilothermic, and those are what we would really tend to think of as cold-blooded species, if we want to use that term, where they have body temperatures that fluctuate in accordance with the overall surrounding environment that they're a part of. So there's very little regulation in terms of their body temperatures. Bats are flying mammals, and having that type of lifestyle is expensive energetically. Going hand in hand with being a flying mammal, many bats tend to be small. So as a group, we're talking about an order of mammals that tend to be smaller on average than other groups of mammals. And again, it's energetically expensive to be flying and to be small. So especially in temperate systems where most Vespertilionid species are really the abundant bats that we have on the landscape, you have seasonal changes in temperatures and climate, and so having that variable temperate climate as well as the needs for maintaining a lifestyle for flight and at small size, all of that wraps up into a point that there's a need for bats to be heterothermic, and this is really interrelated with our understanding of how they function on the landscape and where they're found and a lot of those types of questions. So bats are heterothermic really on relatively short time scales. On a daily basis, they'll go into torpor, where they'll lower their overall metabolic activity for relatively short periods of time. They can do that for multiple days, but really on the scale of days we're talking about here. And then, of course, many bats will lower their metabolic output for an extended period of time, and in that case, they're doing that around the winter months, and they'll go into hibernation. So using torpor and going into longer bouts of torpor and hibernating are ways that bats are able to really save their energy reserves, and it allows them to occupy specific areas when they're seasonally productive. So they're able to be active in regards to their foraging and their reproduction when the habitats that they're generally found. The Vespertilionids are the most diverse group of bats that we have all across the globe. They're nearly worldwide in their distribution, and generally for Eastern North America, we have Vespertilionid species with a couple exceptions here and there. We're generally talking about Vespertilionids. These are bats that are relatively plain looking, and I say relatively plain looking because there's still a lot of variation in how these bats appear, from the really large ears that you see on some of the Carinarhinus big-eared bat species to some of the Myotis species, like the small-footed bat that we see here in the lower right-hand corner of the slide. This is an image from Fenton's lab, and it appears in the Vaughn et al. Mammalogy text, and it's pretty representative of our Vespertilionid species that we have here in Eastern North America. Again, we're dealing with an insectivorous group of bats. They tend to have relatively broad wings, and that uropatagium is large. When I say uropatagium, I'm referring to the skin that spans between the tail and the foot that allows a great surface area. And so in general, these are bats that are quite maneuverable and able to fly at relatively slower speeds as compared to some other different families of bats. For Eastern North America, we have a whole list of species that to date have been listed as endangered. Some of the initial species that were listed as endangered were the Indiana and gray bats, dating back many decades with declines relating to their hibernation sites. In the 70s, in fact in 1979, the Ozark and Virginia big-eared bat species were listed as endangered. These are two different species that are quite restricted in their distribution and have low overall population sizes, and those are the primary reasons for their listing, as well as the potential for disturbance around those caves that they use as hibernation sites. More recently, we've seen the listing of the Florida bonneted bat, and this is actually a molossid species. So it's not a Vespertilionid species. This is a relatively large-sized species of bat that's really restricted to the extreme southeast portion of North America. It's really only found in southern Florida and in that sort of coastal environment. So a very restricted, rare, infrequent distribution of this species, and that relating to the likelihood for disturbance and impacts for the overall populations of that species are the primary reasons for its listing as an endangered species. And then, of course, the northern long-eared bat, which is really varied in its overall distribution, contrasting with the Florida bonneted bat. The northern long-eared bat is widely distributed across North America, while it's been a little bit difficult to have truly representative population estimates of this species all across its distribution related to just how it hibernates and how it's found across the landscape. I think most people that work with bats in the east can all say that the northern long-eared bat has really been one of the more common bats that you would capture across the forested landscape of eastern North America up until the arrival of white nose syndrome. So what I'd like to do now is move through the major groups of bats that we have here in eastern North America and just sort of distinguish them from one another. I'll first begin with the big-eared bats. These are very, very conspicuous in terms of the sizes of their ears. This is a group of bats. This genus, Corinnorhinus, includes the Virginia and Ozark big-eared bats, which are listed as endangered, and also includes the Raphanus big-eared bat, which is in concern through various portions of its distribution. These are bats that are probably best known, in addition to those bizarre, just really neat-looking ears that they possess. They're best known as the species of bats that are gleaners. They're able to forage for prey, not just by echolocating for prey. They do that, but it seems like they also are able to use passive listening and detect the presence of moths on surfaces when they're at rest. And so these are bats that are able to exploit that moth prey resource while they're at rest. So they're able to sneak up on prey, take them from surfaces, and that's in contrast from what a lot of other bats are able to do. Big-eared bats do rely upon hibernation, and overall they're relatively short-distance migrants as compared to some of the other species groups that I'll talk about here shortly. But they are found in a variety of hibernacula throughout eastern North America. Tree bats are really another major group of bats that bear mentioning here within the overall landscape of eastern North America. We use this term to refer to species that lie within the genus Laziurus, but also there are a couple other species of tree bats. The one that's depicted here on the bottom left portion of the screen is the silver-haired bat, and it's another tree bat species. These are species that aren't necessarily reliant upon caves for roosting. Oftentimes they'll use foliage out on the landscape within dead, dying, or even live trees, or be able to roost within dead snags and whatnot. They're able to exploit a large number of various types of roost conditions. These bats rely on hibernation to varying degrees, and that relates to their propensity to migrate across the landscape. Some of the best examples of long-distance migrants that we have for bats here in North America are these tree bat species, and they're able to cover very, very large swaths of land, and then once they get to more southern portions of their distribution, they'll migrate to that point and then hibernate for a relatively shorter period of time, and they're able to hibernate in a variety of different conditions. Some of these Laziurus species are known for conspicuously hibernating within dead leaf material on the forest floor, and that in and of itself is something that was interesting years ago as hey, what could be the impacts of prescribed fire on these bat species with early season spring burns if they're still in leaf material coming out of their portion of hibernation within that annual life cycle. Maybe there's some sort of impact there. So there has been a focus in some portions of the literature on those types of questions. The mouse-eared bats, finally, are the group Myotis, and this is the overall group that includes most species of concern. I apologize for the the misspelling of species there. But these are bats that use both hawking and gleaning strategies to varying degree. They're able to take prey out of the air, which is what those tree bats tend to do, and they're also able to glean prey, which is what the big-eared bats do, to varying degrees depending on the species that we're talking about here. These are bats that do hibernate for longer periods of time in caves and mines and in various conditions and human-made structures here in eastern North America. And they are species that will migrate to core roost locations for portions of the year. And these are species where white-nose syndrome has had the most conspicuous effects that we've seen to date. There are a handful of other species that don't fall into a neat package the way that the big-eared bats, the tree bats, and the mouse-eared bats do, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention species like the big brown bat here on the right that are found in caves, and they're quite large solitary roosters where the presence of Myotis destructin has been found on these bats, but they don't seem to be affected by white nose to the same degree that we see impacts on Myotis species. And then also, of course, the tricolored bat or the eastern pipistrelle bat, as it was previously known, is shown here on the left. And these are another solitary roosting species that we find in caves during winter months and are impacted by white nose, and they're a species of concern to be mentioned for that discussion. White nose syndrome, by way of a quick explanation, is a disease that's killing, at this point, millions and millions of bats all across eastern North America that's caused by a yeast-type fungus. It was first detected in February of 2006 in New York, and this is a disease that's linked to this widespread mortality that we're seeing for bats in caves during hibernation periods. And these are bats that are dying because of accelerated loss of body mass and dehydration, and basically they don't have the resources to make it through the hibernation period when they're impacted by this fungus that grows on them. It's worth mentioning that the first instances of widespread mortality that we were seeing due to white nose syndrome were species that roosted and hibernated in relatively large clusters. Species like the Indiana bat and the little brown bat, we were able to observe widespread mortality across the landscape early on, but now we're starting to see mortality of other species that roost in smaller numbers or even singly, like the northern long-eared bat and the eastern pipistrelle. And so there's some variation there. Here is the most up-to-date map for the spread of white nose syndrome. Those yellow arrows point towards the arrival of this fungus. Those various arrows that I'm now showing here relate to the travel of this disease sort of down the spine of the Appalachians, as well as up from its early arrival, and then even heading westward into Canada in sort of the mid stages of the spread of this disease. And more recently, the white nose syndrome has really begun to impact bats as far west as Arkansas and Missouri and Iowa, and we're really seeing a spread of this disease throughout the eastern deciduous forest. So there's the question that remains of what's going to happen with this disease. Can it march westward across the plains? Can it get to the Rockies and begin to head westward? Those are questions that people are beginning to think about, and it's scary, and there's clearly some need to understand what are the impacts of this disease if it was to carry on further west. I'll wrap up my portion of the presentation today with a couple what I see as important talking points whenever we're talking about the impacts of white nose syndrome on Myotis bats. We know that bats are important, especially here in North America with the vast majority of species being insectivorous. We have nearly 50 species of bats found across North America, and the vast majority are solely insect-eating species. And this paper by Boyles et al. That came out some years ago has largely been cited as, hey, we can put a price tag on the impacts that bats have on agriculture, on their predation levels of insects. It's worth mentioning the estimates presented in Boyle et al. Are variable from I think 3.7 to $53 billion is their estimate of the ecosystem services provided by these insectivorous bats, and clearly there's a lot of variation around this estimate that they've generated, but I would underscore that that's billion with a B. We're talking about a huge sum of money that's derived from the ecosystem services of these bat species. A more recent paper, this came out in 2014 in Bat Research News. I think this is an interesting next step, and this is a sort of a thought piece that came out in that publication, looking at really what might we be able to estimate in terms of the impacts of white nose syndrome on insectivory release and changes in ecosystem function in eastern North America. So with this paper, we have really the summary of the results within this report presented here with this figure. And the overall size of these various pies or circles here relates to the overall population size estimates that we know from visiting hibernating groups of these various species. So many little brown bats as compared to overall smaller estimates of distribution-wide population numbers for say the eastern small-footed bats. So there's variation here in the sizes of these pies. The remaining black portions of the pies corresponds to the remainder of the populations that we see across their distribution in eastern states where white nose was detected over multiple years. And so you can see this varied impacts of white nose according to species here, and I would make the point that the northern long-eared bat has suffered dramatic declines. And of course, we all know that there's severe impacts here. But also, I would note that the northern long-eared bat has had relatively low population estimates at caves, at hibernacula over the years because they roost in smaller numbers. They're found sporadically throughout these hibernation sites. They're not found in those large clusters the same ways that you'll see little brown bats or Indiana bats sort of found across these various hibernaculas. So while it may appear deceptive that we're talking about one species here that's of relatively low abundance compared to other species, I'll end with this slide, which really does demonstrate how widespread this species is here. You can see the northern long-eared bat distribution really does span from the western portion of the continent to the northeastern portion, all the way down to Louisiana. So we have a dramatically widespread species to talk about here, and of course the implementation of the 4D rule for this threatened species is important because white nose is having differential effects on this species all across the distribution. So with this final slide sort of being a segue into the northern long-eared bat specifically, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and he'll be able to jump into a discussion of some of the various effects of silvicultural practices on this bat.
Great, Luke. Thank you so much. I'll just remind folks that are on the phone line here that we have the phone lines muted, but you can feel free to type any questions that you have into the chat box, and we'll address them at the conclusion of the presentation. Mike.
Okay, bear with me, folks. We're all fighting a cold at home, so my voice breaks up a little bit on you. I'll try to keep it working properly. I'd like to first begin by giving you a kind of an overview how I tend to proceed with the rest of this presentation. Briefly going to talk about our two key T&E forest bat species. From there, we'll move into their general habitat needs, and from that transition to basically a discussion of the effects of prescribed fire and silviculture on forest structure. And then, of course, look at the few studies that do exist looking at bat responses to these changes in forest structure. And in this sub-area, we'll probably, or I will concentrate quite a bit on the fire work that Luke and I and others have been involved with here in Kentucky. And I'll close by talking a little bit about the existing regulations that we now have in place for T&E forest bat species here in eastern North America. Okay, imperiled forest bats. All right, first of all, we can't begin without a discussion of the Indiana bat. It has certainly had a huge impact on forest management here in the east for some time now. The Indiana bat and the northern long-eared bat are, in a way, two species that use forests very similarly, and we'll get into some of those patterns here in a little bit. Luke's already covered some of the elements of the natural history of the Indiana bat that I was going to address, so there's no need to reiterate those. The Indiana bat is actually slightly larger than the northern long-eared bat. Tends to have forearm lengths approaching 36 to 38 millimeters, which is, again, northern long-eared bats tend to be more on the 34 to 36 millimeter end. So it also is a little bit heavier bat by about an average of 1 gram per individual. Obviously, it is endangered, and so because of its listing status, a lot of forest management in the east has been governed by protocol surrounding recovery of the Indiana bat. The northern long-eared bat, which you'll see again based on the slide that Luke presented and what I have here, has a much larger distribution, but the core of the distribution is very similar to that of the Indiana bat. And so in terms of actual management of the two species, we have a large segment of eastern North America where both occur, and where management protocols then will involve both species simultaneously. That will obviously create some discussion and some issues, particularly as we shift to areas of the northern long-eared bat distribution that do not overlap with the Indiana bat. And so now we have new regulations in place for folks in those parts of the distribution that they didn't have to deal with before. The other thing to consider too about the northern long-eared bat, because of its vulnerability to white nose and its potential distribution that essentially connects the east to the west, this is a species that I guess could potentially be a conduit for movement of white nose across the landscape. And so it's one we need to pay very close attention to. One thing I want to point out from the image that you see here down to the left is the northern long-eared bat tends to have, in essence, ears that are noticeably longer than that of the Indiana bat. And I don't have a real good image, unfortunately, to show you of the tragus, which is a fleshy lobe on the inside of the ear of the northern long-eared bat, but it is quite long as well. And in fact, if you take the actual ear itself and fold it forward, it actually extends several millimeters beyond the tip of the nose. So from a direct observation point of view, it's pretty easy to clearly separate northern long-eared bats from Indiana bats. Also, if you look down at the very bottom of the image, there is a white strip just to the left of the inside on the uropatagium from the foot. That is the calcar. It's a cartilaginous tissue. The Indiana bat actually has a fleshy lobe that subtends down from it that the northern long-eared bat does not, and that is often used as a diagnostic characteristic to separate the two species. But again, northern long-eared bats tend to be a little bit smaller on average in body size, and so we can separate them in the hand. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about just habitat requirements of these two species in general. And this certainly relates to almost all bat species. What you see here, I've been involved in quite a few radio tracking studies, both here in the East and in Western North America. And with most bat species, when we're implementing prescribed burns or we're implementing silvicultural prescriptions, we have to realize that this represents potentially a very, very small percentage and component of the actual area and home range used by a typical bat species. And in fact, radio tracking studies actually give us a fairly constrained view of the size of the area that bats use, because the equipment generally only lasts, or the transmitters only last for about 3 weeks maximum. So in terms of the actual total area that the bat uses, or an individual bat uses during the actual growing season, it's probably significantly larger than what we normally measure in a 2 to 3 week tracking period. But you can see from here that bats cover a lot of variation and elevation and contours. This image actually is from the image to the left is actually from Western North America, where we have elevations in Idaho ranging from about 8,000 feet down to 6,000 feet. And so in this particular case, these bats are not only covering large distances, but also large changes in elevation. You should note, particularly in the red home range, that there's two smaller areas, one near the top, one near the bottom. Those are what we refer to as core areas, where bats tend to frequent those sites more often than they do the rest of the home range. Core areas are typically associated either with high insect densities, location of preferred roosting sites, and also availability and access to drinking water. And so you can essentially take the same approach to here in the East. And here are some data from a study that I had done by a student, with a student at East Kentucky many years ago on red bats, a species that Luke talked about a little bit earlier. And again, you'll see a lot of these home ranges overlap. The bats will actually work the same areas together. All of them involve a riparian corridor, stressing the importance of water. And if you look at the actual estimates for foraging areas down to the lower right, you'll see that the sizes range anywhere from 113 hectares up to 192 hectares. For those of you who are more tuned into American terminology, you can essentially divide these in half, and that'll give you roughly the actual acreage involved in the size of the areas these bats use. So if you take the 134 hectares, divide it by, because there's actually roughly 2.2 acres per hectare, that's giving you a home range of around 65 acres. And so if you think in terms of silvicultural practices, we tend to view stands on a 10 to 20 acre scale here in the East. That roughly then translates to anywhere from a quarter to a third of the actual home range of the bat. So when we are implementing these prescriptions, we are affecting only a portion of the area that the bats actually use when they forage at night. Okay, access to drinking water. I've placed this here as a reminder to me to let you all know that we do see differences in terms of where bats forage, particularly where they access water. Northern long-eared bats, for example, for the longest time were not caught very often over streams and corridors, and therefore were perceived, at least early in my career, as a bat that was fairly uncommon. However, once we started shifting gears and folks started actually netting ponds and forests, we started to realize, hey, this is where they are. And they actually tend to come to ponds and forests to drink a whole lot more readily than they do stream corridors. And so having these on the landscape can be extremely important in terms of maintaining quality habitat for these bat species. Other things to consider relative to use of landscapes is edge habitats and corridors, particularly corridors inside forests. One of the things that will happen with logging operations is the development of access roads for the equipment to get in and out. These roads are often left in place afterwards. They may be blocked off so that folks can't get through, but the bats can. And these are very, very important in terms of providing flyways and commuting corridors. And in the literature from the Deep South, where we have had a fair amount of work done by Steve Castleberry and his folks at the University of Georgia in pine forests, they've actually found a lot of bat species will roost in trees along these forest corridors. So they provide important habitat elements for commuting, foraging, as well as roosting. Also, in terms of the actual diet of these bats, Luke's already alluded to the ability of particularly Myotis species to capture insects in flight, as well as capturing insects off of the surface of objects, as he referred to as gleaning. Moths are key to, I think, conservation of forest bats here in the East. They represent a significant component of the diet of all of our Myotis bat species. And studies to date that have looked specifically at moths and the response of moths to forest management all essentially show a lot of work out of Somerville's lab would suggest that if we can maintain plant diversity, we can maintain moth diversity, and then by doing both, we can then therefore hopefully create a more optimal habitat for bats from the standpoint of improved foraging success. One thing that I'd like to add here, and that is that northern long-eared bats, being a species that can echolocate at very high frequencies, they actually augment their gleaning strategy by echolocating at frequencies so high that the moths do not have the ability to detect them and know that they're coming. So there's a nice interplay there in terms of what the moths are capable of hearing versus what the bats do in response to that. The flip side of that would be the big-eared bats, which echolocate very, very softly and actually use passive listening, in other words, listening for prey-generated sounds to identify prey that they then would glean off of surfaces. So even the gleaners do things differently from among each other in terms of how they capture their insect prey. Okay. The next area of importance for bats has to do with roost trees. For the longest time, we tended to track bats to what we call the modal tree, or the primary roost tree, where the majority of the maternity colony would remain for the bulk of the summer. But studies over the last 10 years, 10, 15 years, actually going back to Kurth and Koenig's work in Europe, and then Robert Barkley and Mark Brigham's work in Canada started to now show that this fission-fusion behavior is probably very, very common to almost all of our forest bats. And what I mean by this is there is a primary colony tree, but bats also use satellite trees around that primary colony tree, and there is a fair amount of movement back and forth among these trees. The importance of this has been looked at from the standpoint of social interactions, but also from a conservation point of view, that being if the primary tree actually falls, because most trees that these bats use are snags, so they have a fairly defined lifespan, they need to have already identified alternate trees that they can move to, which essentially become the new modal tree should the primary tree fall in the forest. And so fission-fusion behavior is a way to not only maintain sociality and communication among members of the maternity colony, but to also allow bats to then utilize and be aware of other potential roost trees should the dynamics of the forest change. And of course, when we log forests, we have to basically be aware of the fact that, yeah, we can protect the primary modal tree, but there are also going to be satellite trees that may or may not be used. And when those are removed, we are altering potentially the dynamics of a particular colony, and so we need to be sensitive to that and that's probably where designations of protected areas or distance functions really can be important in terms of maintaining the overall habitat quality for a particular maternity colony. Specific to the Indiana bat here, you see two images of roost trees. In the case of these two, you'll notice both are dying, decayed trees, which is what Indiana bats prefer, and they tend to prefer them in gaps in the canopy. One of the main reasons we think for this being, this allows the tree to actually heat up during the summer months, and that ultimately then facilitates the growth and development of young, given that they have only a limited amount of time for their young to be raised, to achieve adult body size and be ready to enter hibernation that following winter. Now, interestingly, in contrast to that, over the years, folks that have worked on northern long-eared bats have started to notice that in many cases, northern long-eared bats are far more flexible in the types of trees they use. They'll actually use live trees more often than do Indiana bats. And their trees will often be in areas that don't have a clear open canopy gap, but can have a more closed forest canopy. Now, why that difference is, I don't think we all readily know the answer to that yet, but it's clearly something to be aware of when we're looking for management or looking for roost trees and developing management plans associated with roost trees. To the right, it represents a tree that was impacted by a prescribed fire on the Daniel Boone National Forest that was used by northern long-eared bats, and even though the prescribed fire damaged the tree considerably, it remained standing, and the bats actually came back to the tree 2 days later and continued to use it the rest of the summer. So again, northern long-eared bats much more flexible in their selection of roosts than our Indiana bats. I've provided this slide to basically give the audience an opportunity to realize that those of us who've been working with bats for a long time, we like to understand patterns and relationships, and we're still trying to figure out what those patterns really are. And in a chapter written by John Hayes and Susan Loeb several years back in the book Bats and Forests, they essentially came up with these four generalized relationships for the relationship of the abundance of bats to numbers of roosts, the amount of clutter in the canopy, the availability of water on the landscape, and the availability of prey. And these are all still being tested and validated one way or the other. Most data sets tend to support these to some degree. For example, if you look at the one for availability of water, you'll see the curve starts already at a point to the right of the left axis. In essence, there is a point where water is essentially so scarce that you won't have bats on the landscape. However, once a water source appears or is created, a single water source can actually support a large number of bats in an area, and so the actual abundance of bats escalates fairly quickly once we get a minimum amount of water available on the landscape. Okay,
Mike, sorry, Mike, I just want to cut in. We're getting a little tight on time. I want to be sure we get to the silviculture and prescribed fire. I apologize for interrupting.
Okay, I will try to speed things up. Okay, and then really quickly to the right, where we talk about availability of prey relative to bats, you'll see that that curve escalates slowly and, of course, peaks very rapidly, and that's a reflection of insect swarms and the ability of a large number of bats to exploit insect swarms. Okay, here's where we're going now. Okay, first of all, what does silviculture do, in essence, or most silvicultural practices, to forest structure? What you see here are three images. One to the upper left is a clear cut. Obviously, when we clear cut a forest, we take out the canopy, the mid-story, and the understory, and create a very open flight space, which changes the conditions for the bats, but also changes the conditions for insect prey. And historically, we used a lot of clear cuts here in the east. That no longer is the case. And in fact, if you look at some of the really early literature that looks at bat response to clear cuts, particularly in western North America, the large size of clear cuts that used to be used created basically deserts in the center of the clear cut where there was very little use by bats because there was very little insect prey available. If you go to the image down below, which is more typical of what we see with two-age systems, again, you still have some layering now, some canopy, but your mid-story and your understory are still fairly cleared out. So we have basically reduced clutter here and opened up foraging space. So we would think that this could potentially lead to a response by bats. And then, of course, it's always important to realize the extent to which we cut forests and how that affects how bats view the entire landscape that they're flying over. And one of the things that still needs to be figured out, I think, is at what point do we implement so many cuts that we actually drop the overall habitat quality? I don't think we have an answer to that right now. Okay, prescribed fire. Well, prescribed fire does things a little differently than logging, but the outcome in terms of changes in vegetation structure can be very similar. Depending on the severity of the burn, cool burns will tend to take away the understory, much of the mid-story, but leave the canopy, the overstory canopy, largely intact. The hotter the burn, the more severe the burn, of course, then we also alter canopy structure. One thing I would add that's really different from prescribed fire versus silvicultural practices in most cases, particularly if you're using two-age systems, is that there's more variation within the stand in terms of differences in patterns of structure with prescribed fire than there is with silvicultural logging, because logging tends to be implemented more uniformly, whereas fire burns on its own. We don't really control. Once we light it and ignite it, it burns on its own merits based on wind speed, fuel loads, and so forth. And so we do see considerable differences there in terms of what's happening within the stand. Some work done in Missouri by Boyles and Aubrey when they were looking at evening bats clearly showed that if you had a burn forest, the ability for canopy light to actually penetrate was very, very high, especially across the growing season, certainly compared to an unburned forest where you don't get the same light penetration. And what Boyles and Aubrey found was that after prescribed fires were implemented, evening bats moved into the forest, moved into the stands, and used these trees in these burned forests. And their perception or their belief was that the reason why is because these trees are now in more open conditions. They're heated with solar radiation, creating higher temperatures in the roost trees, facilitating the growth and development of young. And so they concluded that prescribed fire, at least from the point of view of roosting bats, was a positive, had a positive impact on habitat use of bats. Okay, response of bats to what we see on the landscape. Very quickly, we need to realize that there are basically three general foraging strategies for bats globally, what we call closed space species versus open space species, and then edge space species. We'll ignore the middle one because the middle category tends to be used more often in Australia and Africa, where we actually see bat species that stay along edges of habitats all the time. So we don't really use that terminology here, and so we'll limit ourselves to the closed versus open. These basically represent two groups that are very different. The closed space species, which would include our Myotis bats, are slow flying. They have fairly short, broad wings. They're maneuverable, and they echolocate at higher frequencies. Open space species tend to have longer, narrower wings. They fly faster. They either fly above the forest canopy or within the gaps of forest if they're large enough, and they echolocate at lower frequencies. This open space species group would include your lazarines, silver-haired bats, essentially the migratory tree bats, if you will. Okay, if you look at what has been done relative to even age management in eastern forests, the studies that do exist relative to use of shelterwood cuts, seed tree cuts, and so on, the overall response by bats in terms of use and activity shows an increase in most studies. So whenever these practices have been implemented, bats will move in and take advantage of the fact that we have less clutter. And in essence, even if the prey base hasn't increased, their accessibility to the prey base has. The one that was mixed was the first one by Hart et al., where they used clear cuts. They didn't define the size of the clear cuts in their study, and I would suspect that they were quite large, and that's why they got the mixed response. Uneven age management in eastern forests, you'll see again, wherever group selection cuts have been evaluated. This is essentially, for those of you who may not be quite familiar with this terminology, I would make this akin to patch cuts. Again, we see an increase in bat activity in every single study that has looked at it. Mark Ford's work, some of his work in West Virginia did get some mixed response to the creation of canopy gaps, and I believe that had a function, or was a function of essentially a fairly wide variation in the diameter size of some of these gaps, and so he didn't get the same pattern or the same effect from bats in all cases. Thinning has been a whole lot less studied, and really with very limited results in terms of does thinning create enough reduction in mid-story and understory clutter to facilitate foraging bats. The jury's not out. The few studies that have been done have not showed much of a positive response at all. Okay, response to prescribed fire. Okay, again, I'm going to focus mostly on what we've done here in Kentucky, and I want to begin with work that was really spearheaded by Matt Dickinson. And here what they did is they tried to develop what they call a plume model, where they essentially tried to estimate what happens as the fire moves through the stand in terms of the generation of carbon monoxide and heat that could be affecting bats when they're roosting in the trees when the fire is lit. What you see here to the right are the results of a meta-analysis that I did relative to published studies on Myotis, which is the northern long-eared bat, versus Myso, the Indiana bat. You'll see, first of all, the roosting heights of Indiana bats tend to be higher. Roosting heights of northern long-eared bats lower, but again, that standard error bar, which is actually 2 times the standard error, or represents roughly 95% of all the roosting heights, shows a range anywhere from about 5 meters up to 9 meters. So given those 2 values, if you look at the outcome of the models that Matt Dickinson and his group generated, basically they had sensors placed as you moved in elevation above the flame, and if you look at these folds, they drop very, very quickly from the back end of the images down, such that as you go from height above the flame from 5 meters to 10 meters, it really levels off in terms of the potential exposure that bats would be experiencing either to gas temperatures or to carbon monoxide, which led them to conclude that many bats, particularly those that are roosting higher up in trees or at the higher end of their roosting distribution, are not likely to be directly impacted by heat or carbon monoxide poisoning. And in fact, some of these studies were done while we had bats tagged in trees, and the bats that we had tagged, northern long-eared bats, actually exited the trees within 10 minutes of setting the fire. So even though bats do enter shallow torpor during the daytime in the summer, they were able to quickly get up, get out, leave before the fire got too severe, and they came back once the fire subsided and died down, and they came back to the same trees. Okay, another thing we looked at, again, via radio tracking, was how these bats then responded following prescribed fire. Again, this works on the Daniel Boone. What you'll see here in the top box, I want you to focus on 2 things. It says closest on the left, farthest on the right. Basically, this is a distance analysis that we did based on the telemetry points of where bats were in the forest. and the analysis showed that post-burn, the majority of northern long-eared bats placed their home ranges either immediately over or adjacent to the burned habitats. In other words, they didn't avoid them. They were foraging actively in the burned areas. And if you look at Table 2 down below, you'll notice in response to the same study, same sites, if you look at the pre-burn versus post-burn estimates for all insects combined, excuse me, you'll see that post-burn, the abundance of insects went up significantly, and so therefore the conclusion that we drew from this is that the bats shifted their home ranges in response to the increased availability of insects following prescribed burning. This represents a fairly short-term response within the first month or two following burning in the same season, and so it's hard to know whether this sustains over time in years post-burn. More data are clearly needed for that to happen. We've also looked at canopy structure. This is work spearheaded by Luke Dodd, where and Nick Skoronsky. Nick, I think, is actually participating in this call today. They developed a set of LiDAR data that basically described the canopy layering from the ground to the canopy, and then matched that against where the bats were flying in the forest at Mammoth Cave. And again, this is a complicated looking figure to basically break it down to nuts and bolts. The clutter adapted or closed space species were in different locations than the open area or open space foragers, with the open space foragers typically being associated with gaps in the canopy, whereas the clutter-adapted species tend to be associated in areas where we had mid-story cover and clutter where they, essentially are fine, fire or no fire. And so we are getting a little bit of a different response there. We've also looked at bat activity in response to time since prescribed fire. Again, at Mammoth Cave, there has been a history of prescribed burning, and roughly about a third of the park has been burned at some point. Some of the burns have been 7-8 years now, others more recently. And so we looked at activity of bats, overall activity. This includes both open and closed space species. And you'll see that, again, unburned habitats where no disturbance has taken place still supports the highest activity. But if you look at recent burns versus older burns, the older burns are starting to show a shift back toward the unburned condition. So initially, at least for some of the responses we're seeing at Mammoth Cave, the actual response by bats immediately post-burn across the entire assemblage of species in the park was not immediately positive, but they're still there. And eventually they come back to use the sites more and more as we get time since fire. We've also more recently tried to look at our data in response to the degree of burn severity. It's a data set that I'm working on right now. Again, you'll see for the high frequency files, which would be your closed space species, severity of 0 would be no burning versus severity of 1 and 2. And again, we're seeing the same pattern of a drop in overall activity as we go from 0 to 1 to 2. And that holds for high frequency and low frequency echolocators. Again, if you look at the severity 0 category for the low frequency flyers, quite a wide amount of variation, which makes it really difficult for us to actually detect any real differences. So at least initially in response to burn severity, we're getting changes in terms of reduced clutter, increased gappiness, but bats are not initially exploiting that, at least on a within canopy basis. Okay, I don't know if we still have time to cover regs a little bit here. I have one primary point to make to the audience, and that is that the Indiana bat and the regulations surrounding the Indiana bat have been with us for some time now. And so whether we listed the northern long-eared bat or not, for the bulk of its distribution, forest management will remain governed by the protocols for the Indiana bat, which are at this point in time a little more restrictive than what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is asking folks to do relative to the northern long-eared bat. One thing to point out, at least for those folks that are involved in prescribed burning activities, the limits of April 1 to 30 September remain in place, and of course those are encouraged also for the northern long-eared bat at this time. The interim 4D rule for the northern long-eared bat also has some constraints, not nearly as great as we have for the Indiana bat. Most of them are centered around two things: a quarter-mile radius surrounding hibernacula and maternity colonies, and then of course a constraint on forest management practices, particularly during the pupping season of 1 June to 31 July. So this is a narrower time frame than what we're applying to conditions with the Indiana bat. And of course, deviations required can be, or deviations can in this policy can be agreed upon in consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service, particularly when we're dealing with areas outside the white-nosed buffer zone. Of course, that buffer zone is probably going to expand and grow with time, and eventually that will probably be modified as white-nose spreads further west, northwest, and so forth. So again, we've already had constraints on logging and constraints on burning because of the Indiana bat, and those constraints really will remain wherever the distributions of the two species overlap. Okay, and I'll stop at that point, and we'll hold for questions.
All right, thank you, Mike. That was fantastic, both your presentation and Luke. I'd like to remind folks that the webinar is being recorded, and it looks like we only lost a couple people, actually, out of everyone that's on the webinar to other appointments. But yes, thank you so much. We had a couple of questions come in during the presentation. The first question I saw was on the topic of forest plant diversity influencing insect diversity and leading to bat forage success. What types of forest plants? Trees, shrub layer, low shrub, herb layer? Anything more specific?
Well, I would say you can definitely draw parallels with understory plant diversity with Lepidopteran diversity in general. But with some of the canonical correspondence analysis that we've done there at Mammoth Cave, we actually saw some correspondence between some of the more diverse and really abundant groups of moths with overstory parameters. So we're talking about the canopy trees having a driving force on the impact of the occurrence of some of those moth species. So I guess what I would say in general is that in terms of overall insect diversity, and specifically foliivore insect diversity, it's the understory that's going to drive biodiversity patterns, but at the same time too, the overall occurrence of whatever your dominant overstory canopy trees are is going to have some impact on the overall abundance of the major moth families that we have here in eastern North America.
Got it. Thank you. Another habitat question was roosting in snags because they are in hollows.
Come again?
I think the question was, are bats roosting in snags because the snags are in hollows?
No, not necessarily. In fact, I would, my perception has always been that we tend to locate bats and snags at mid-slopes or upper slopes more than we do in riparian corridors, which is interesting because historically BMPs and forest management practices have always targeted riparian corridors, obviously for reasons of protecting water quality and temperatures and so on and so forth. But again, the selection of snags in upper slope positions, essentially those tend to be more exposed to sun on average, remain warmer, and if you're trying to raise young in a heated environment, you're going to have a better chance at it if you're up on the ridge top than you are in the stream bottom.
Got it. We had another question from the same participant. Are pregnant bats or bats with pups seen leaving roost trees during fires? Because take of a listed species during prescribed fire is an issue.
I think they do. I don't know that anyone specifically documented that. The bats that we saw emerging were adult males because that's what we were given permission to radio tag during the course of the study. But adult females will move their pups from roost to roost for a lot of other reasons, like the accumulation of parasites in the roost, or a shift in the availability of food supplies on the landscape. So they do move their young, and I would guess that in a prescribed fire setting, I would not be shocked at all if that is the case.
Oh, and we had a clarification on the hollows question. The question was, are the bats in the hollows of the tree?
Sometimes. Many cases they're under exfoliating bark. But they do use both. Indiana bats tend to use hollows to a less degree than do northern long-eared bats, but they can and they do use them. Normally, when folks think in terms of tree hollows, it's the Coriolanus bats that folks are thinking about, because in bottomland hardwood forests, those particular species are readily use hollows of live oaks and so forth. But yes, they can.
Got it. Thank you. Gosh, the questions are really coming. Here is another, it looks like more of a comment that I'd like to hear your thoughts on. Robin Weber says, perhaps I missed something, but there hasn't been anything said here that would suggest to me that the NLEB, which are not specialist species, should become a listed species. In fact, response to various management strategies appears to be mostly positive, and I would think a formal listing would therefore have a detrimental effect on the species, while also having significant negative effect on other forest-dwelling species for which forest management to preserve habitat is common. Would either of you like to comment on that?
I'll take it. Well, actually, I think the listing of the northern long-eared bat has nothing to do, or very little to do with what's happening on the forested landscape. It's strictly a function of white nose syndrome and the inability of this particular bat to withstand impacts of the Pseudogymnoascus fungus. Our work at Mammoth Cave has clearly showed a precipitous decline in those bats, in that part of Kentucky, and they were really common when we began the work back around 2009, 2010, and they're not anymore. And I think the listing is as much a function of the huge loss in numbers of bats during hibernation as it is anything else. Now, the fact that we have protocol being utilized or asked of folks during the summer season in our eastern forests stems from the fact that we have to do everything we can to create a situation where the survivors have a fighting chance, if you will, to reproduce and slowly over time, hopefully, repopulate the species as the effect of white nose levels off, if that indeed is the case. There certainly is some evidence to suggest that that's what's happened in Europe. We have data, for our bats here at Mammoth Cave. In fact, there's a paper that should be coming out very, very shortly, where we found that the survivors of white nose, at least after the first couple of years, were heavier in body mass than the average bats before white nose arrived. So there is the possibility that there is a scalar effect, and that a percentage of the population is large enough and heavy enough to withstand the impact. Now, my biggest concern right now has to do with the fact that we have been catching these folks, or these bats, in spring, and what we're noticing, at least one of my other grad students has noticed, is a lot of the adult females, as they emerge during staging, are not reproductively active. And so that becomes a major concern in terms of their ability to actually produce offspring and successfully rear offspring.
I guess this is Luke here too. Another point that I would make along with the comment that was offered is that, as far as I understand it, much of the control and much of the focus of the interim 4D rule is focused around roosts, whether it's hibernacula or roosts that are found on the landscape. And while there may be mixed or positive responses due to silvicultural practices for these foraging bats, we just can't get around the fact that the caves and the mine portal entrances, a lot of these hibernacula, regardless, they need to be protected. And so, at least it seems to me that their listing is very much structured around having some sort of enforcement power for those areas where we know that the bats are found through the significant sort of portions of their overall annual sort of lifestyle.
Thank you. Yeah, so it sounds like definitely the regulations have good intentions, but I'm sure there are folks on the call that might have thoughts as to how, whether the regulations are really meeting the needs and, without having a negative effect on other habitat requirements for other species. I'll switch back from the policy and go back to a question about the white nose syndrome. One participant asks, where did the white nose syndrome originate prior to upstate New York? And are there any updates on potential control of the fungus?
Well, I'm not sure about updates yet, but we'll cover what I do know. There was a lot of debate in the beginning years as to where it came from, what happened, and in essence, as word got out, European colleagues started to look at their cave systems, and eventually, over time, we realized through various tests and studies that the genetically exact same fungus that we have here is the one that they have in Europe. And now the prevailing thought is that the fungus was transported from Europe to North America, either by cavers or biologists. It's really no way to know. But we think the source for the fungus is Europe. One thing that I would educate the caller on is that if you go to Europe or at least read up on European bats, you'll find that almost all their bats are listed in some way, shape, or form in most countries. Their populations are low, certainly much lower than ours. They have only a single cave in all of the European continent where there's 100,000 bats or more, and that is in the Czech Republic. If you look at what we have here in North America, we have, quite a few caves of that size in terms of the numbers of bats that are supported. So I think the consensus among many of us is that the fungus was in Europe many, many years ago, had its impact, knocked the populations back, and what we see in Europe now are the survivors and the descendants of those survivors. And hopefully, we'll have the same thing take place here. There will be survivors, and we won't lose any species in the process. What we don't know is whether Europe did or did not lose species in the process. And right now, if we have one that's really seriously in trouble, clearly the northern long-eared bat fits that bill. And so that's a long answer to the question. As far as updates on progress, there's certainly people looking at, possibilities of bacteria and other elements to curb the fungus. But I don't think there's been no breakthroughs yet that we're all really excited about.
Great. That's a really good answer to a seemingly simple question. We just had a couple more questions pop into the chat box. I know some folks are leaving, but we still have 48 participants registered on the line. Another question related to white nose syndrome. I've heard suggestions that the southeast populations of northern long-eared bats may roost in trees year-round. If so, are these populations less vulnerable to white nose syndrome?
Excellent question. We'd really like to know the answer to that. I think it's a debated topic among those of us who work with bats as to whether or not, if you get to the peripheral edge of the distribution of the fungus, particularly in the deep south where the caves do not support the kind of temperatures that the fungus needs to grow, whether it's even cave bats that may not be affected in the deep south. Southeastern Myotis, for example, is the species where the larger number of individuals of that species occur in the deep south, particularly Florida, and there's the possibility that that species may be fine because the fungus cannot grow in those caves. Now, the further south you go, the greater the likelihood that bats remain in trees year-round. We don't have a lot of data to support that yet, but we certainly have some. And I would argue that, I think there's going to be some peripheral populations that remain in trees or remain in buildings, particularly like big brown bats, all winter long, and therefore they won't be affected by the fungus, hopefully.
And I guess I would add to that, too, something that occurs to me is that, with any roosting during the hibernation season that's taking place outside of caves, I think the success as far as avoiding the impacts of white nose, that's really going to be due to the sort of the patchy distribution of those resources. And relating to that would be size of the colonies of bats that use that resource during the hibernation period. But northern long-eared bats don't necessarily roost in those large numbers, and yet we're still seeing massive declines all across the landscape. So regardless of whether or not bats are forming large colonies, we know that they're really suffering from white nose just due to the widespread reduction that we've seen in this species and the hints that we have for the tricolored bat sort of across its distribution too. So it's going to relate a lot to how sort of patchy these hibernation resources are along sort of the peripheries, I would say, of the distribution of species.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, we had another. I'm sorry. Yes, I muted myself. We had another question. What are the natural predators of bats?
The natural predators: owls, snakes, raccoons. They have quite a few actually. But in terms of their ability to impact the demographics of bat populations, it's limited.
Great. We had another question, more going back to prescribed burning. Why would there be less bat activity in sites following prescribed burns when the roost trees are intact and the abundance of insect forage availability increases?
That's a good question, and I think part of the answer has to do with the actual landscape again. What's available to the bats? When we burn or we log, we are only affecting a small percentage of the bat's home range. And so they're not necessarily in those sites all the time. They don't have to be. They have other areas that they frequent. And so, again, we don't have all the answers. And so, I think it's based on a percentage of the landscape available to them and where their time goes, proximity of the burns to water, so on and so forth. I think we obviously need more work. We need to know more.
And I would also add too, with our results that we've generated at Mammoth Cave since 2010, we're not necessarily seeing a positive response of various insect groups with fire the way that we saw some examples there on the Boone. And so there's not necessarily correspondence there. And then, things are different at Mammoth Cave as well. It's a pretty fragmented landscape as far as like our road network and the availability of the Green River sort of cutting right through the heart of that landscape. So it may be that if you're seeing occurrence prey sort of at the same level in the areas that have been, burned versus unburned, and not really much of a change happening there, that these bats may be able to sort of get around and forage easy enough in the unburned areas, as opposed to what other studies that we've done have demonstrated.
Interesting. I have a final question, somewhat related. Can silvicultural treatments implemented to mimic natural disturbance, such as fire, in a non-uniform manner, create the habitat structure desired by bats?
I definitely think, I'm actually hoping that's actually the case. The one project that I'm involved with Jeff Stringer and folks at the University of Kentucky, we're actually looking at bat response to selective logging, shelterwood harvests, in comparison to undisturbed habitats, and we're going to be monitoring these sites for the next 4 years, and we're hoping to see that, in fact, we're predicting, I think, a positive response in terms of use of these sites, not only for roosting but also feeding. But the study essentially just began this summer, and we haven't put the cuts in yet. That'll happen this winter. And so maybe in a year or two we'll have some answers to that.
Wow, great. Yeah, let's hope that's soon enough for the bats.
I would also say with that, Amanda, too, like another point to make too is, given that we know that just generally the home ranges for bats are on the scale, at least here in the east, that you have multiple stands or sort of management units that you're working around, that it makes good sense to sort of manage in that mosaic sort of heterogeneous perspective, because at the least you're certainly promoting insect biodiversity, which we know is critical as a prey resource, not just for bats but for all kinds of critters, birds or otherwise. So why not manage along those lines, for bats, and to sort of maximize the effects for other groups too.
Great. Wow. So we're actually at 12:30 Eastern, 12:33 Eastern. I'm willing to open up the phone line, but before, and I'm sure we're going to lose some folks when we do that. But before that, I definitely want to give a huge thank you to both of you, Luke and Mike, for this amazing presentation. This was so much information, so much knowledge on bats, fire, and forest management. This is really great. I'm sure everybody is giving you virtual applause from their office seats right now. But thank you very much to both of you for sharing all this information.
Well, we appreciate the opportunity.
All right. I'm going to be brave and open up the phone lines. We'll see if anybody has questions on the phone lines that would like to speak up. Could get a little chaotic here. So again, thanks everybody for joining us, and my apologies for the extra noise. All right. Anybody out there have questions? Okay, if you don't, while folks might be coming up with questions, I'll just add, a quick note. Someone had noticed that there's a website, whitenosesyndrome.org, for white nose syndrome updates. So that's on our chat log, but just a reminder. I'll also remind folks that on the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange website, that you can find a link to the webinar recording for this and for past webinars. You can also find out about our November 4th through 6th capstone workshop in New Jersey. And you can sign up for our newsletters. Does anyone have questions for our presenters?
Well, that's a planner person there. Yeah, sure. And maybe I get Matt here.
All right. I'm really just hearing background noise. I think this is probably a good time for us to sign off and end on a good note. Thank you again very much, Luke and Mike, for your great presentation, and thanks everybody for joining us today.
I think it's 11. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, that's Nick. Yeah, I think so.
All right, man.